My village, Hlynivka, had always been a quiet, almost forgotten place nestled in the shadow of the Carpathians. Wooden cottages clung to the steep slopes, surrounded by dark pines, while nights were punctuated only by the occasional howl of the wind or the crackle of a wood stove. But something had changed. The silence was no longer peaceful. It had turned sinister. It began 3 weeks ago. The first disappearance seemed like a cruel accident. Old PYLYP was gone, leaving his front door slightly ajar, as though he'd willingly walked into the icy darkness. The village whispered about wolves, a wandering bear, or perhaps a desperate stranger seeking shelter. Then another villager disappeared, and another. By the end of the first week, a chilling pattern emerged. Each disappearance was heralded by a single knock on the victim's door. Just one deliberate knock, shattering the midnight stillness. People close to the vanished swore they'd heard it but dared not investigate. Yet somehow, the victim still disappeared. Fear gripped the village. Meetings were held behind locked doors, candles flickering as villagers debated what to do. The elders whispered about ancient curses and restless spirits. The younger ones dismissed the talk as old superstitions, until one of their own, Vassal, a farmer's son, was taken. That's when I came back. My name is Nazar. I had left years ago to work in the city, but when my mother's health declined, I returned. The village I remembered was steeped in folklore, but the people now looked hollow, shadows of themselves. When I heard about the disappearances, I laughed. "It's a bear," I said to the group gathered in my mother's kitchen. Or maybe wolves. Hungry animals lose their fear of humans in winter. "Wolves don't knock," one old woman whispered, her voice trembling. "And bears don't leave doors open." I dismissed their fears as nonsense, but their haunted eyes stayed with me. That night, after my mother had gone to bed, I sat alone in the small kitchen, my rifle resting beside me. The fire in the stove cast flickering shadows on the walls, and outside, the wind howled like a restless spirit. Midnight came, and I was just about to head to bed when I heard it. A sharp, deliberate knock echoed through the house. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The knock came again, louder this time, and I grabbed my rifle, creeping toward the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing, just the black void of the forest night. I hesitated, then flung the door open, rifle at the ready. The cold bit at my face as I scanned the yard. Snow stretched out undisturbed, save for a single trail of footprints leading toward the woods. The prints were strange, too large to be human, but oddly humanoid in shape. They seemed to almost slither across the snow, as though their maker had barely touched the ground. When morning came, I told the village council what I had seen. Some believed me, but most thought I was only adding fuel to their superstitions. That was until I showed them the footprints. Even the most skeptical among them couldn't explain their shape. "This isn't natural," I said, "but it's not a ghost either. I'll track it." Father Mikola, the village priest, pulled me aside as I prepared to leave. "Be careful, Nazar," he said. "There are things in these mountains that don't belong to our world. You might find more than you're prepared to face." I brushed off his warning, but his words stayed with me. As I packed my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that he might be right. Yet I was determined. Whatever was out there, I would find it and stop it. That night, as I left the village and stepped into the dark embrace of the forest, I couldn't help but feel as though I was being watched. And deep down, I knew the forest wasn't the only thing hiding secrets. The cold air stung my face as I made my way toward the forest's edge. My rifle hung heavy on my shoulder, a bag of supplies strapped to my back. I could feel the weight of the villagers' stares from behind shuttered windows as I walked through the village. Their fear was palpable, clinging to me like frost on my skin. The woods loomed ahead, their towering pines a jagged wall of shadow. As I stepped beneath their canopy, the world shifted. The sounds of the village, the distant bark of a dog, the creak of shutters in the wind, faded into silence. Only the crunch of my boots on the snow broke the oppressive stillness. I followed the strange footprints from the night before. They were partially obscured by fresh snow, but still visible, winding deeper into the forest. The shapes unsettled me, growing stranger the longer I stared at them. Some seemed almost human, others animalistic, and yet they never fully conformed to either. The hours dragged on as I tracked the trail, my senses on edge. The deeper I ventured, the darker and colder the forest became. The trees here were ancient, their twisted branches tangled together to form an almost impenetrable canopy. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision, darting between the trees, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. By midday, the trail led me to a small clearing. I stopped to rest, the weight of my rifle comforting as I leaned against a tree. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind through the pines. As I unwrapped a piece of bread, my gaze was drawn to a strange, gnarled tree at the edge of the clearing. Its bark was scarred with deep, deliberate marks, symbols that seemed both ancient and chaotic. They twisted and writhed in the dim light, making my stomach churn. Tentatively, I reached out to touch one of the carvings. The bark was warm, almost pulsing beneath my fingers, and I pulled my hand back as though burned. A sharp crack shattered the silence. I spun around, rifle raised, my heart pounding. There was no one there, only the endless expanse of trees. I stayed in the clearing for a while longer, scanning the shadows, before reluctantly pressing on. As the day wore on, the footprints began to change. They grew larger, more erratic, and at times vanished entirely, only to reappear in impossible places, on the tops of rocks, or crossing streams without disturbing the ice. It was as if whatever I was tracking was toying with me, leading me deeper into the forest's clutches. By nightfall, I reached a small frozen stream. The tracks ended abruptly at the water's edge. I stared at them in frustration, scanning the area for any sign of movement, but the forest was still. It was as though the thing I was following had simply vanished. With no choice but to stop for the night, I set up camp near the stream. A small fire crackled at my feet, casting flickering shadows on the trees. I sat with my back against a rock, my rifle within arm's reach, as I listened to the forest breathe around me. The hours dragged on, and though I tried to stay alert, exhaustion weighed heavy on me. The fire's warmth was a poor shield against the cold, and every sound, every crackle of the flames or snap of a branch, set my nerves on edge. And then I heard it, a knock. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustle of the wind, but it froze me in place. My fingers tightened around the rifle as I strained to hear. The knock came again, louder this time, echoing through the darkness. It wasn't coming from the trees or the ground. It was coming from beneath the ice. I scrambled to my feet, my breath visible in the cold night air. The firelight flickered, as though disturbed by an unseen force, and the knocking grew more frantic. It reverberated through the clearing, a hollow, deliberate sound that made my skin crawl. Peering at the frozen stream, I saw movement beneath the surface. A shadowy figure writhed in the black water, its form indistinct but undeniably alive. My stomach turned as the knocking became a thunderous pounding, rattling the ice and sending cracks spidering across its surface. Without thinking, I grabbed my pack and rifle, kicking snow over the fire to extinguish it. I didn't look back as I fled the clearing, the sound of the knocking chasing me into the night. When I finally stopped running, the forest was silent once more. I leaned against a tree, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my ears. Whatever was beneath the ice, it wasn't natural, and it wasn't finished with me. I knew then that the forest was far more dangerous than I had imagined. But I couldn't turn back, not yet. Somewhere out there was the answer, and I was determined to find it. By the second day, the forest no longer felt like a place I recognized. It wasn't just the silence or the cold. The woods themselves seemed to twist and warp around me. Trees that had once stood straight now leaned at impossible angles, their branches clawing at the sky. The ground beneath my boots felt softer, almost spongy, as though something beneath the surface was shifting. The footprints I was following had become maddening. They would lead me forward for hours, only to vanish entirely or double back on themselves. At times, they seemed to mock me, spiraling in meaningless patterns that led nowhere. It was as if whatever I was chasing knew I was there and was toying with me. I came across strange landmarks as I pressed deeper into the woods. Trees with their roots tangled above the ground like grotesque fingers. Circles of stones surrounding patches of earth that were charred black but held no ash or sign of fire. Once, I found a clearing littered with bones, animal and human, arranged in spirals that pointed toward the forest center. I stopped there, my stomach turning at the sight of the bones. They were brittle, yellowed with age, but some looked disturbingly fresh. I scanned the trees, my finger hovering over the trigger of my rifle. Nothing moved, but the oppressive feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. The trail eventually led me to a narrow ravine. The ground here was uneven, littered with jagged rocks and slick with frost. As I descended carefully, I spotted an old wooden bridge spanning a frozen stream. The structure looked ancient, its planks warped and its ropes frayed. The footprints ended abruptly at the bridge. They didn't cross it, nor did they lead along the ravine. It was as though whatever I was following had simply disappeared. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, but something deeper, stubbornness or perhaps sheer desperation, pushed me forward. As I stepped onto the bridge, the wood groaned under my weight. Each step felt precarious, the planks threatening to snap at any moment. Halfway across, I heard it again. The knock. This time, it was deafening, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the ravine. My heart leapt into my throat as I froze, gripping the ropes tightly. The knock came again, louder, and I realized with growing dread that it wasn't coming from behind me or ahead. It was coming from below. I glanced down at the frozen stream, my breath catching in my chest. Something moved beneath the ice, a dark, writhing shape, its form barely distinguishable in the churning black water. The knocking grew more frantic, each impact shaking the bridge. The ice began to crack. I bolted, my boots pounding against the wooden planks as splinters flew into the air. Just as I reached the other side, the bridge let out a sharp crack, and one of the planks shattered. I turned to see a gaping hole where the wood had given way. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie, suffocating silence. The forest on this side of the ravine felt different, darker, heavier. The trees were larger, their trunks twisted like ancient statues. Snow barely covered the ground, revealing patches of earth that seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. As night fell, I came upon a cabin. Its roof sagged under the weight of snow, and smoke curled lazily from the chimney. A faint light glowed in one of the windows, and for a moment, hope flared in my chest. Maybe someone here could help me, or at least offer some explanation for the horrors I'd witnessed. But as I approached, that hope twisted into dread. The footprints were back, circling the cabin in chaotic, overlapping patterns. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, my rifle raised. The air was thick with a metallic tang, and the faintest hint of rot lingered on the breeze. I pushed the door open cautiously, the creak of the hinges cutting through the silence. The cabin was dimly lit, a single lantern casting flickering shadows across the room. The walls were covered in strange carvings, the same chaotic symbols I had seen on the gnarled tree in the clearing. In the center of the room was a table. On it lay a map, yellowed with age and covered in faded ink. My eyes scanned the parchment, noting landmarks, the ravine, the bridge, and a point further north marked with a black X. Before I could study it further, the knock came again. It echoed through the cabin, impossibly loud. My blood turned to ice as I spun around, rifle raised. The room was empty, but the lantern swayed gently, its light flickering as though something unseen had brushed past it. The knock came again, louder, and this time, it felt as though the very air was vibrating. I backed toward the door, my heart pounding, but the moment I stepped outside, the knocking stopped. The clearing was empty. The footprints were gone. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed the map from the table, stuffed it into my pack, and ran. The knocking resumed as I fled, echoing through the trees like a drumbeat, relentless and unending. By the time I stopped, my legs burned and my lungs felt like they were on fire. I leaned against a tree, pulling out the map with trembling hands. My eyes locked onto the black X. Whatever was happening in these woods, it was leading me there, and I had no choice but to follow. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the black X on the map. It seemed to pulse, almost glowing faintly in the dim light of the forest. My hands trembled as I folded the map and tucked it back into my pack. Every fiber of my being told me to turn around, to abandon this hunt and return to the village. But I knew I couldn't. The knocking would never stop until I saw this through. The forest grew darker as I moved toward the ridge where the map had marked the X. The air was colder here, heavy with a metallic tang that stung my nostrils. Snow thinned, giving way to patches of bare earth that seemed damp despite the freezing temperatures. The trees became larger, their trunks gnarled and twisted like ancient sentinels. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision, but whenever I turned to look, I saw nothing. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as though the forest itself was watching me. The trail led me uphill, the terrain becoming steeper and more treacherous. Loose rocks shifted under my boots, and thorny underbrush snagged at my clothes. The path was faint, almost indistinguishable, but I followed it with a determination that bordered on desperation. When I finally reached the top of the ridge, I stopped to catch my breath. The sight below made my stomach drop. The valley stretched out before me like a blackened scar on the land. The trees here were sparse, their trunks charred and skeletal, as though consumed by some ancient fire. The ground was littered with bones, animal and human, arranged in spirals that radiated outward from the center. And at the heart of it all stood the altar. It was a hulking slab of stone, its surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to writhe and shift in the dim light. The sight of it filled me with a deep, primal dread. This was the source. I could feel it as I descended into the valley. The air grew heavier, pressing against me like an invisible weight. My footsteps felt sluggish, as though the earth itself was trying to hold me back. The closer I got to the altar, the louder the whispers became. They were faint at first, like a distant breeze, but grew louder with each step. The bones forming the spirals were disturbingly fresh. Some were cracked and brittle, others still glistened with moisture. Deep grooves and jagged marks covered their surfaces, as though they had been gnawed by something with impossibly sharp teeth. When I finally reached the altar, the whispers stopped. I stepped closer, my rifle clutched tightly in my hands. The carvings on the altar seemed to pulse with a sickly light, their shapes impossible to comprehend. Twisted figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes stood etched into the stone, all bowing before a shadowy entity that towered over them. Its head was crowned with what looked like antlers or horns, and its gaze seemed to pierce straight through me. I hesitated, then reached out to touch the altar. The moment my fingers brushed the cold stone, the ground beneath me trembled. The carvings began to glow brighter, their shapes shifting and writhing as though alive. A low hum filled the air, rising in pitch until it became a deafening roar. And then the knocking began. It was everywhere, reverberating through the valley and shaking the ground. My vision swam as I stumbled back, clutching my rifle. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices that filled my head. I turned to flee, but the ground in front of the altar erupted. A figure rose from the earth, its gaunt form wrapped in shadow. Its limbs were too long, its movements too smooth, as though it were gliding rather than walking. Its ember-like eyes locked onto mine, and a wave of cold washed over me. I fired my rifle. The sound was deafening, but the figure didn't falter. The bullet passed through it as though it were made of smoke. It moved closer, the glow of its eyes intensifying. I fired again and again, but nothing stopped it. The knocking grew louder, pounding in my ears like a drumbeat. I felt as though my head would split open. The figure extended an impossibly long arm toward me, and a searing pain shot through my body. With the last shred of my strength, I dropped the rifle and grabbed the dynamite from my pack. My hands shook as I lit the fuse and shoved the bundle against the base of the altar. The figure's eyes burned brighter, and its whispers turned to a scream. I turned and ran, the earth trembling beneath my feet. The explosion came a moment later, a thunderous roar that shook the valley. I was thrown to the ground, the force of the blast knocking the wind from my lungs. When I looked up, the altar was gone. The spirals of bones were scattered, the carvings obliterated. The figure was nowhere to be seen, but the faint glow of its eyes lingered in my mind. The valley was silent, the oppressive weight in the air lifted. But as I climbed back up the ridge, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The knocking might have stopped, but the forest felt no less dangerous. Somewhere in the shadows, I was certain it was still watching me. Climbing out of the valley, I fought the urge to look back. My legs trembled, and my chest burned with every labored breath, but the fear of what might still be lurking below kept me moving. The silence was deafening now. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the faintest call of birds. It was as if the forest itself had been stunned into stillness. The altar was destroyed, but I didn't feel victorious. Whatever that thing was, the shadow with burning eyes, it had let me go, and not because I had defeated it. The forest on the other side of the ridge was no longer recognizable. The trees twisted like contorted figures frozen mid-scream. The snow on the ground had melted, replaced by a spongy, dark earth that squelched beneath my boots. The air felt heavier here, saturated with a metallic tang that clung to my throat. I needed to reach the village, to warn them that it wasn't over. But as I walked, the forest seemed to stretch endlessly before me, the path doubling back on itself like a cruel trick. Then I saw it, the glow of two ember-like eyes in the distance. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink. They just watched, burning into me from the shadows. My rifle was gone, left behind in the valley, and I felt naked without it. The map in my pack was the only thing grounding me now, its edges worn from my grip. The eyes disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared, but their absence wasn't a relief. I knew they weren't gone, just waiting. As I pressed forward, the forest began to change again. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining to form an oppressive canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging in the darkness. The knocking returned. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible over the sound of my footsteps. But with every step I took, it grew louder, more deliberate. It echoed around me, seeming to come from every direction at once. My pace quickened, my pulse racing. When I emerged from the trees, I found myself standing at the edge of another clearing. This one was different. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its trunk gnarled and blackened as though scorched by fire. Strange symbols were carved into its bark, glowing faintly in the darkness. The ground around it was bare, the earth cracked and dry. The knocking stopped the moment I stepped into the clearing. I approached the tree cautiously, my hands trembling. The carvings on its surface seemed alive, writhing and shifting like living things. They reminded me of the ones on the altar, but these were more intricate, more chaotic. As I reached out to touch the bark, the air around me seemed to shiver. A low, guttural hum began to rise, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. Then the shadows moved. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, their forms gaunt and distorted. Their eyes glowed like embers, and their movements were unervingly synchronized. There were dozens of them, all converging on the clearing, surrounding the tree, and me. My breath caught in my throat as I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The figures closed in, their whispers filling the air like a swarm of insects. I clutched the map in my hands, its presence somehow grounding me in the chaos. One of the figures stepped forward. Its eyes burned brighter than the others, and its shape was more defined. It raised a hand, its fingers impossibly long and clawed, and pointed at the tree. The whisper stopped. "You broke the seal," it said, its voice low and guttural, like stones grinding together. "I destroyed the altar," I managed to say, my voice shaking. "It's over." The figure tilted its head, as though amused. "You destroyed nothing," it said. "The altar was a door, not the source. You opened it." My blood turned to ice. What do you mean? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped closer, its hand outstretched. The symbols on the tree began to glow brighter, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. The hum grew louder, resonating in my chest. I stumbled back, my mind racing. The map. The X wasn't just marking the altar. It was marking this place. This tree. The figures closed in, their whispers rising into a deafening chorus. I gritted my teeth, clutching the map as though it could protect me. My eyes darted to the tree, to the symbols that pulsed with an unnatural light. This was the source. I dropped the map and reached into my pack, pulling out the last stick of dynamite. My hands shook as I lit the fuse, the fire sputtering in the cold air. The figures didn't move to stop me. They just watched, their glowing eyes fixed on me. With a shout, I hurled the dynamite at the base of the tree. The explosion was blinding, a thunderous roar that shook the ground and sent shockwaves through the clearing. The tree splintered, its trunk shattering as the symbols burned away in a burst of light. The figures screamed, a horrible, guttural sound that made my ears ring. One by one, they began to dissolve, their forms disintegrating into the darkness. And then it was silent. I stood there, trembling, as the clearing slowly returned to stillness. The tree was gone, reduced to a smoldering stump. The figures had vanished, and the oppressive weight in the air had lifted. But as I turned to leave, a faint knocking echoed behind me. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down my spine. Whatever I had done, it wasn't finished. The forest was silent as I stumbled back toward the village. The explosion had shattered the oppressive atmosphere in the clearing, but its weight lingered in my chest. My legs ached, and every breath felt like fire in my lungs. The tree was gone, the figures dissolved into shadow, but the faint echo of the knocking still haunted me. The moonlight filtered through the thinning trees as I neared the village. The familiar sight of its rooftops brought a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. Even from a distance, I could sense the unease. The village wasn't free of this. Not yet. When I stepped into the square, the few villagers still outside froze. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear. They stared at me as though I were something foreign, something tainted. My mother emerged from the crowd, her frail frame trembling as she approached. "Nazar," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're alive." I nodded, though I wasn't sure the word truly applied to what I felt. "It's done," I said, my voice hoarse. "The altar, the tree, I destroyed them." For a moment, hope flickered in their eyes. Then someone asked, "Is it over?" I hesitated. The question lingered in the air, heavy with expectation. I wanted to say yes, to give them the peace they so desperately craved. But the faint knocking in the back of my mind wouldn't let me. "For now," I said finally, "but the forest isn't safe. Not anymore." Murmurs spread through the crowd, a mixture of relief and dread. The villagers began to disperse, retreating into their homes with wary glances at the forest. My mother reached for me, her hand trembling as it rested on my arm. "What happened out there?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I couldn't answer. Not fully. "I did what I had to do," I said. The words felt hollow, but they were all I could manage. That night, I couldn't sleep. The village was quiet, but my mind was restless. Images of the altar, the tree, and the burning eyes played over and over in my head. The whispers seemed to linger in the corners of the room, just out of reach. And then I heard it, a single deliberate knock. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. The sound echoed through the house, filling the small space with an oppressive weight. My rifle was gone, left behind in the valley, and I felt defenseless. The knock came again, louder this time. It was coming from inside the house. I got to my feet, every muscle in my body tense. My hands shook as I moved down the dark hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath me. The sound echoed again, steady and deliberate, leading me toward my mother's room. When I pushed the door open, the room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn, but my mother was gone. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped inside, the knocking now a faint pulse in my ears. And then I saw them, two glowing ember-like eyes, staring at me from the corner of the room. The shadows shifted, coalescing into the tall, gaunt figure I had seen in the clearing. Its presence filled the space, suffocating and cold. "You cannot escape," it said, its voice a low, guttural rasp that seemed to vibrate in my chest. "You brought me here. What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, the glow of its eyes intensifying. "You opened the door," it said. "You are the tether. I am bound to you now." My stomach churned as its words sank in. "No," I whispered. "That's not possible." "You cannot run," it said. "You cannot hide. The knocking will follow you." The figure dissolved into shadow, leaving the room cold and silent. I stood there, my heart racing, as the weight of its words pressed down on me. I returned to the square, the chill of the night air biting at my skin. The village was still, its houses darkened save for the faint flicker of lanterns behind drawn curtains. I looked toward the forest, its dark silhouette looming like a living thing. The knocking came again, faint, rhythmic, relentless. I closed my eyes and drew a deep breath. I had destroyed the altar, but it hadn't ended. Whatever I had unleashed, whatever was bound to me, wasn't going to stop. Somewhere in the heart of the forest, it was waiting, and no matter where I went, it would follow. I opened my eyes, staring into the darkness. The knocking would never stop, but I would face it, just as I always had. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, and I'd love to hear your comments.